Okay, good morning, everybody. Welcome to the third tutorial, let's say, about building a web application backend. And just a quick recap about the last two lectures. We have seen that it is possible to specify the API for our web application through a standard formalism, a standard language that is called OpenAPI. And we have seen that actually it is possible by using available tools to produce a skeleton of our web app, which corresponds to the application server that you see in this slide. Okay, so we have seen that there is an editor, there is an online editor for writing the API by following the OpenAPI formalism, and through that interface we can generate the skeleton of our application. And we will move on now from the generation part, let's say, and see how we can really take that skeleton and build the complete web application that on one side has access to a database, as you can see here with the elephant picture, the data layer. And on the other side also serves static assets, which we mean with that we mean HTML files, JavaScript files, and CSS files that constitute our web application. Okay. Now, before doing that, I would really like to go a little bit back about and reconsider the API specification that we wrote in the last lecture, and extend it with a few other elements that we need to make our really toy example a little bit more complete. Okay, and for doing that, I prepared already in my, let's switch in to the editor, Swagger.io. I've extended and I will discuss here a little bit with some details the action that I did on the original API. And let's see how I extended it. I mean, you can see the original /books endpoint for accessing books, and it was this endpoint was meant to be used for getting the state of a collection of resources, that is book resources. Okay, and this is pretty much the same as we wrote last time. So we had a number of parameters that were meant to be used in the query part of our URI, and they were offset, search, and limit, and we talked a little bit about the meaning of these parameters. And the additional endpoints that I've added are the following. The first one is /books/ curly parenthesis book ID. Now, this notation is used for exposing endpoints, let's say, for creating a hierarchy, of course, of endpoints. I mean, /books book ID is hierarchically contained in the /books endpoint, and this endpoint allows us to access a specific book identifier by passing in the path component of the URI the identifier itself. Okay, it's a way of getting a single book information by providing the ID, and this is useful, of course, for getting only the information that you need for a specific, for rendering, for example, a specific page. Okay, and that's the summary and the description. I think that they should look, straightforward. Now, the fact that we use a curly parenthesis here with the book identifier must be, it's an information for the generation of the skeleton of our server. That must be extended with what do we mean with the book identifier. There is a question on the chat that says, create another endpoint, like how can be considered. What do you mean, Pietro L'Imperio? You can even open your microphone and ask directly. Don't worry. It doesn't work? Oh. Okay. Just if you can just rewrite your question that we can then answer. I'm just going on with the presentation, and then let's see whether maybe the answer is already contained in what I will show you. As I said before, the curly parentheses that we used for our endpoint, that means that this is a placeholder for a concrete number, a concrete identifier that when I use the API I can put there just to get the information of a specific book identifier. And I must complete this this placeholder information with the parameters section, where I recall the book identifier that I specified here, book ID, and I specify that this must be present in the path of our of the URI that I use for accessing that specific resource, and other information related to the actual representation of this type. That is an integer, of course, and maximum 64-bit. And it is required. I mean, if you want to use that specific endpoint, that must be specified. Responses are pretty much straightforward, in the sense that the success response returns an object that has the schema described in the definition sections, and it's the usual book schema. And of course, recall that while the /books endpoint was returning an array of books, in this case /books/id must return a single book if it exists. Okay, otherwise here you can see some error messages. I guess that these two are it may seem redundant, but they allow to really specify a little bit in detail what happened with the error, in the sense that if you specify something that it is not an integer, you might want to return that an invalid ID has been supplied. While if the integer, if the identifier was specified correctly as an integer, but the book doesn't exist, you might want to return a not found resource. Okay. I mean, using status codes, it's a little bit of, I mean, you are on your own, in the sense that these are only examples that might be, used as a reference for, defining how you would, you could use status codes in your application, in the sense that depending on the the interaction between the front end and the back end, you might want to differentiate between different errors, or just collapse every error into a single error. So that's more or less up to you, and how do you want to be detailed into providing, for example, error messages to the user. The other two endpoints that I've added here are are related to something that we are doing, if not today, tomorrow, in the sense that we are going to see how to add some authentication to our app. We know that actual web application provide some functionality only when the user is logged in and has provided some credential to really witness that he is what is saying to be. So we will add two additional endpoints for managing the authentication, and the first one is a user's login. And this user's login, it's not let's say it's something that is might be seen as a sub-resource of the user collection, but in this case it's just an indication of something of an action that a user can do. And this endpoint will be used for will receive the content of a form, and we specify here that with the consumes field of the resource description, and this is the media type associated with the form data. Okay, and the parameters that are meant to be used, are meant to be present in the form, are specified again through the parameters section. But note that in this case the parameters are have a different position, in the sense that now they must be present in form data, both the username and the password. Okay. The responses are pretty much also in this case self-explanatory, in the sense that we were going to get a successful login, and if we get a successful login, we get a 200 successful operation, while if the user is not authorized, we are going to return the 401 status code. Okay. Finally, there is another the endpoint. There is an additional endpoint that is called /user/me, that only if the user is logged in, that returns the information about the current user. So every user, once it's logged in, can invoke this endpoint, and depending on the of course on the user, we're going to see how this dependency with respect to the status of the session is going to be provided. And some of you that know already cookies might want to have a look at them. Otherwise, of course, we're going to have a look at them either today or tomorrow. But I mean, this /user/me returns the information, which is an object of type user, that is in the definition section, and returns the information associated with the user. So if we are authorized, this information is correctly returned. So if the user is successfully logged in, then this information is returned to the user itself. For example, you might want to use this information for rendering the name of the user and other information like his address, etc., in a particular page. So this you might want to use this kind of template for also for other things in your application. But if the user is not logged in, then the response is not authorized. Let's see how I've extended the definition section with the user and object. The user object has a of course, a description, a title, it's an object, and the properties are an identifier, a name, an address, and well, in this case, a credit card, because this is a simple bookstore where I can buy books, and all these are strings and pretty much self-explanatory. And there is also an example, just to have our skeleton, work with some data. That's pretty much it, in the sense that this is going to be our the API specification that we need for this series of tutorials, in the sense that now we're going to just build bit by bit our server in order to manage data, real data coming from a database, answering to API requests, and also the authentication section associated with the web application. Of course, you might want to extend to all that we're going to see in your application domain, and probably there might be something that should be changed, but I think that you are going probably to see all the templates that might be useful for your app. So let's go and let's generate again our server, because actually whenever I write a new specification, I have to generate a new skeleton. Now there has been some question during the last days on how to update the specification and generating a new server and merge the server that you are writing locally with the updated skeleton that you get from the Swagger editor. Typically, this is a process that can be done by hand, and of course, to minimize the effort, my suggestion will be to really focus first on the API, try to consolidate it, and then generate the skeleton. Okay. And then whatever changes in the future, hopefully not, but if you must do any changes to the specification, then you might want to import manually the changes in locally in your development environment. Now we're still at the beginning. We are going to really generate the server and installing the dependencies and start from there, writing our app. So let's generate the server, and this I generated a package, a zip file, and I'm going to create a new directory, new folder. Let's say I'm calling hype example number 2. And I'm going to move the package that I downloaded from the Swagger editor. This is number 1. Okay. Here, and I'm going to unzip it. Okay. Now, if you remember the original server that we wrote in order to run it, we have to install the dependencies. We do it with an npm install dot. Okay, and now we should have our server running. So if we run the server and go to localhost 8080, we are going to see our server. If you remember correctly, the only endpoint available once installing the dependencies are the one that we specified. So P2 is books, and for example, I can also access book number 0, and I get the book of the only example book that is available now in our skeleton. Okay, that's pretty much something that is going to change later on when we're going to attach a database, but for the moment we get only the example book. Now let's go back to our shell, and we need now to let's switch back to our presentation just to give an idea here. Now, the first thing that we're going to do now is to extend a little bit the add, first of all, a landing page for our application that is providing a very simple HTML file that we're going to serve as a static asset. So the green box that you can see here in the structure of our application is going to be added now in our web application, and I think that we probably started last time to do that, but we didn't finish. So now we're going to do it, and we're going to add a very simple HTML file as a static asset, just to be more comfortable with rendering data coming from the API. So we are going to see an example of how to access the API from the HTML page, and also a way of a simple form to test our authentication. So first of all, the first thing that we're going to we need to do is to edit the index.js file, and no, before we have to install a package which is called serve-static. And this is going to be a plugin that is used for the in the server to serve the static assets from locally from a directory in our local let's say locally here in the directory in which I'm in now. So let's install the -se option that I've used. Let me enlarge a little bit the font. The -se option that I'm using here allows me to update the package.json file that is used to store and to statically, let's say, to save all the dependency information associated with my application. Why this is important? Because with this package.json updated, I can reproduce the environment wherever I want. And whenever you deploy your application somewhere, like for example in Heroku or Google Cloud Platform and so on, those platforms are going to use the package.json that I'm specifying here just to update all the dependencies that are needed for my app. So we've installed static, and now what we are going to do, we're going to edit index.js, and we are going to require the module and I'm going to use serve static name for my module. Okay. And now, how to use this module? If you remember, there is this app object here, which is used for setting up the server itself. This is part of the connect package of which is a standard package in the Node.js package management package database, let's say. And the modules that I've loaded now, serve static, is going to be an additional module to be attached to the server. So, and to do that, I'm going to as you can see here, there are other modules that are attached already in the skeleton, which are called middleware, Swagger metadata, Swagger validator. All this information, all these let's say additional modules that are added to the server. These modules are typically called middleware, in the sense that are that is code that is executed while the server receives resource requests. These are going to set up the handling of the endpoints, and this is done automatically. We don't have to really have a look at this one now. We know that this method here are going to invoke the controllers that I'm going to write later on for handling the requests to my endpoint. But before that, of course, I was just adding my additional module to serve files, and I'm invoking the module with serve static, and I'm passing to serve static the directory where all the files. Oh, there is a question. Sorry. Oh, there is a question about using version 3 of the API. Well, with version 3, there might be something different, and this tutorial now is for version 2. So if you are with version 3, you might want to have a look at the documentation. Okay, so I was saying that we're going to pass to serve static the information associated with the the location in my system or locally where the files must be found whenever a request for static assets is done towards my server. What does it mean? I'm setting up now so far something that is hybrid, in the sense that it's going to serve both endpoints that are going to like books /books ID and so on, and those will serve data through the controllers that I'm going to write later on. But whenever a request comes from the client that is not going to those endpoints, is interpreted as a request for a file that is locally served from this directory, that is dir name, which is the current directory, and I'm going to add /www, which is a subdirectory of the local directory, in order to organize files. What does it mean? It means that now I can create a directory with make dir www locally, as you can see here, and there I'm going to create the index.html file that I will need for as a landing page for my web application. And I'm going to go pretty fast with that. And probably you are more experienced than me in writing HTML files. And it's very simple. It has, you know, a title, bookstore, and this is in the head. And now it has a body. This has the H1 element, which is our first server is running. H1, and we're going to print a list of books. And now for the moment, I'm going to leave a list, a numbered list, empty, that is going to be filled up with data coming from the endpoints of my API. Okay. Then I'm going to have a box here that shows the information about. I'm going to use a class here just to be. This will be the box that shows the current user information. As you might guess, we're going to fill dynamically this data with the data coming from the /users/me endpoint. And then we're going to have a pretty small form for doing authentication, just to show how it works. So our form is going to use a post for providing data to our server, just to log in into our and the action specify the endpoints where the form must be sent. And if you remember correctly, we're going to use this users that /login endpoint that expects you know, a form data, and we're going to provide the form data with 3 inputs type. The first one is text, and as a name, username, which must correspond to the name that I specified in the endpoint parameters, and the value. Let's say username. This is the initial value of our field. The second field is again name and password. And then we're going to have a submit button, which generates the actual request towards the action endpoint. And this concludes the form. Just very, very simple. Yes, sorry. Thank you. Thank you for pointing that out. So now we have to add some scripting to our page in order to interact with the endpoints that now are living in our server, but return, of course, example data. And to do that, I'm going first of all to fill up the list of books that are currently in the server. And to do that, I'm going to create a script section with JavaScript that now, and I'm going to create to get the element the UL element that is in our page, and I'm going to fetch the information from books for now through the fetch call. And as soon as I get the response, I'm going to attach a callback that evaluates the response. Well, typically you might want to manage the errors, whether there has been any errors. For now, I want to really go fast into producing this page, so I'm going just to convert the raw data into JSON. And then with that JSON, render it into my page, which I will do with a for. Now, when you will get experience with JavaScript, you will see that you can do this also without fors, but for the moment, let's stick with the plain old vanilla JavaScript. So for all data in the JSON request, I mean all the books, I'm going to create an element which is a list element, of course. And I'm going to fetch the information from the JSON that I got at the ith position, and I'm going to destructure it into title, author, and price. That is all the fields that I expect in a book. And I'm going to title and author, price, JSON. The element I in position I of JSON is going to be the structure into these three variables that will contain now the title, the author, the price of that specific book. And I'm going to, add some HTML This is the poor man, templating done with JavaScript. So I'm going to really write into the HTML of that item the interpolated string title, author, and price dot value. And if you remember, we also have the price currency, which is a one of the fields that any book has. So now I've completed my for, and I'm going to append this item just after having created it. So my list, append list item, append child list item. Okay. Then we need a few more lines here. The second request that I'm going to do is towards the my user. Look, we are going to add this one later on because I don't want to really, because we're going to see authentication tomorrow. So let's maybe stop here for now, but keep in mind that we're going to change this tomorrow to add the authentication. Now, let's see, now that I've written index.html, how to access it. Of course, I must still run the server. So, okay, this is the form here. And as you can see here, there is no list of books. That maybe there has been some problems. Let's see why we don't get the there may be probably an error in the, let's say, oh, there is an error here. Let me check. Yeah, just to show you a little bit better, there is an error here, which I'm going to solve now. Let's see. Let's go back to our server. Okay, so there is an error. Right, thank you very much, Nicolò. I didn't have the time to install a linter, so that might be useful for you, and it should be for me, but now I don't have the time to install it. So let's go back to our server and reload. Of course, I have to run again the server. Sorry. Okay. Now, as you can see, we have accessed the endpoints, and we have correctly rendered them through our in our page. So just one quick note that you might be already aware of: whenever I access the the web server, the root of a web server without any additional resource, the default behavior is to return the index.html file that is now present in www. So that's how it works. But if you access the original endpoints, for example, book0, you can still access the raw data coming from our server. So that's pretty much what we need to know. So we have coming back to our original structure of the application. We have completed, let's say, the green box that is used for getting data from static files from our server. Now we are going to have a look at the application server. That is, we have the OpenAPI gateway that is the modules that you have seen before. Let me show you directly here. Let's take back index.js. All these middleware, Swagger metadata, and validator and router and so on, these are used for setting up the responders to the requests that come from the clients, and validate them. That is, checking whether they match with the specification that we wrote in the Swagger editor. And so they are part. All this middleware is part of the violet, let's say the violet or the blue block, depending on which color do you see now. That is called OpenAPI gateway. Okay, this is something which is already provided by us whenever we generated the skeleton of our server. Now, what we need to do is to provide a way of answering with the real data to the requests by attaching our controllers. I mean, the controllers are already attached, but they are empty in the sense that they are in the controllers directory. And for example, if I open the book.js file, it's actually it's very, very simple in the sense that there is a handler that is called books book ID get. In this case, it's the handler that expects from the that is associated with the /books/book ID endpoint. And as you can see here, it unwraps the parameters that must be present in the request, just accessing some field in the request itself, and then invokes the actual service that must provide data. Okay, and the service is invoked with book.books/book_ID_get. This book object here is the actual service that will provide data, and it's the actual. So now we're looking at the controller's orange block that you see on the right side in the slide, while the book service here is the object that contains all the method for accessing the database. Okay. Now, for the moment, the structure of the controllers, it's good as it is, in the sense that they unwrap the information and invoke the service for getting data, and that's what we need for now. Okay, as you can see here, books.get, the get to the books endpoint, it's a little bit more complex in the sense that it must unwrap all the parameters that we put in our in the specification of our endpoint, and it does everything for us. So at the end, we must write again in the book service a method books_get, which receives offset, search, and limit, which then we must use for accessing data in our database. Okay, so let's see the service. So we go into the server, we see book service. Now, of course, our original server was providing skeleton data, example data, and this is the place where the example data was returned from our server. So for any book ID get, the data return was the one that I've specified in my API specification, so the example, and the same goes for the books get, which returns 2 books. Now all this code is code that now we're going to rewrite, in the sense that now we want to access the information of our books from a database. So that's something that you want to do in your web app. So let's see how it is done. Now, first of all, let's see how we are going to attach databases in our web app. The first thing that you must be sure of is the fact that you install Postgres. Now, Postgres, it's a SQL database. It's one of the databases that are possible, are usable in a web application environment. It's not the only one, and the choice for that is that there is a free tier in Heroku for using Postgres. While if you want to use MySQL or something else, you might have to pay. So Postgres, it's free. Now we're not going to access Postgres directly. we're going to use an intermediate layer to access it. And using an intermediate layer means that whenever you want to change later on the database technology, the intermediate layer will provide all the functionality to do that without any effort. So the intermediate layer that we're going to use is called Nex. Just let's have a quick look at it. It's knexjs.org. This is the website. It's called a query builder in the sense that it allows us to create SQL queries without, writing actual SQL. Chiara Barbera is asking whether we can use MySQL Workbench to create the database. I mean, if you use MySQL, that's fine. Keep in mind that you might have, depending on your choice for the deployment of your web app, you might have to pay. Then what we're going to do now is to use Postgres, but similar, actions might apply to MySQL. For example, you might want you to use MySQL, and you can still use Next.js to build SQL queries towards MySQL. Okay, so but for example, if you change opinion later on and you want to switch to another database, if you use Next.js, you can do that without any effort because the calls to the query builder are the same. Now, we're going to use directly Next.js, but we first have to install it in our let's install the npm package to use Next. And it's called Next, and we install it with -sc, which saves our okay. So as you can see here, it says that Next requires a peer if you want a specific. Once you decide the database that you want to use, you must install an additional package for that specific database. Since we're going to use Postgres now, I'm going to install the package PG, which stands for Postgres, and I'm going to save it now. Okay. Now, keep in mind that now I have my Postgres server running on my machine, and this is something that you might want to be sure once you've installed the Postgres database. You must be sure that it's actually running on your machine. What we're going to do now is to extend book service. So we're going to so let's see whether I can fix. Since I have to write things, I would like to copy the linter configuration just to be sure that I do not write any. Okay. So first of all, the book service must somehow check whether there is an existing table or not. Now, you might want to create the table directly by using your the interface with the of your database, either the web interface or any other command that allows you to interact with the database. what I'm going to do now is a very simple function that create a very simple function that checks in the database whether the table exists, and if not, it creates it, just to really be sure that the table exists. So first of all, I'm going to create what I call a SQLDB variable that is currently empty. This is going to provide the link to my database connection, and I'm going to provide a method which is called bookdbsetup, which receives the connection to the database, and I'm going to save locally in the variable in this module the connection. Okay. Now I'm going to print some message here. The first message that I'm going to print is okay, checking if the books table exists. Now the SQLDB object, now it's next, it's an object that is returned by next. Now we're going to load the next module in the main file. For the moment, we're going to use it as it is passed to through the connection here object, and I'm going to return the following result. If the schema has table books, then this object here, this invocation to as table, returns a promise, and the promise will evaluate with into a value which is a predicate yes or no. And if that means that if it is yes, if it is true, the table exists, while if it is false, the table doesn't exist. So I'm going to evaluate this method here. So if not exists, then I must create it. I'm going to print a message if it doesn't. So let's create it, just to have some debug information. And now, how to create programmatically through next the table? I'm going to return the value of the create table invocation, create table books, and this returns a table object. And with the table object, I can create the fields. So there is an implicit identifier for each item that is created by using the table increments method. So with this call here, I'm just saying to the next query builder to perform some action into the database and create, and that each item in the books table must have an automatically incremented identifier that is going to be the key to each item. Then I'm going to have the fields associated with the title, of course, and the author, text. and I'm going to have the price, that is with the field value, and the currency, which is also text. And I can also use enumeration type in SQL. And this the status is either available or out of stock. Now keep in mind that we have now a one-to-one relationship between the resources and the object that I'm storing in the database. But this must not be always the case, in the sense that each resource might be a complex, even a complex object that corresponds to, not only a single table in the database, but was a structured, connections between tables. For example, we did at the beginning the example of the order, domain object, which might be, stored into a database, into a, into inventory and something else. So there is not always a one-to-one relationship as the one that we're going to implement here. So we're pretty much safe from this point of view, but you might want to really exploit this fact also for developing your application. Then, now if it exists, then this is okay. So if it exists, then we can just print, okay, it exists, and that's pretty much it. Now, the second thing that I'm going to do now is to extend the books get operation here. I'm not going to extend also books get ID. This is something that you might want to do for yourself, and you're going to do it for your application. I'm just going to provide some examples on how to write controllers and services that provide data for only specific endpoints, not for all. Now, how I can implement this method here. Now, first of all, remember that we have a SQLDB object, which is local to this module, that provides a connection to our database that is set up through the method bookdbSetup. We're going to see later how to invoke this function and where to invoke it, but for the moment, let's keep it like this. Now, for accessing the database, it's very simple. I'm going to use the SQLDB connection, and I'm going to provide directly the table that I want to look up for. And the next query builder has a way to specify limits and offsets by itself. So if I go back to the documentation, for example, you can see that it is possible to build queries that have limits and offsets by specifying additional, by chaining invocation to the connection object. So we're going to really exploit this fact in our books get method, by saying that we want to limit with the argument limit that is passed to this service, and with offset. Now, for the moment, I'm not going to implement also the text search in the database, although there is probably something that you might find in the documentation of the query builder. This is just to give you an example that is functional to our, to the index.html that we just wrote. And then this triggers a query to the database. And this is still a promise that once it's resolved, invokes this method data. Let's decrement the size of the, okay. So the method that I'm going to use now for when the data is available, when the data is ready, there is a question from Gianmarco Manni. If we have in our database more than one object, for example, in our case, event, person, and service, we have to define SQLDB variables in each module. True? Yes. Keep in mind that this is an organization which is pretty much opinionated by me, in the sense that you might want to organize your modules as you feel comfortable. If you see that other organizations might be useful, I have seen during the years that this organization, to have a local connection in each module and exploit that connection, is worked and works. Otherwise, you might really incur into problems with, who does that in terms of, modules in your system. So that's let's say this is a disclaimer. Okay, this is pretty much opinionated, this organization. It's not always the same. It can be even different if you feel that that there is something that works better for your application. So we get data. Now keep in mind that here, if you remember from the let's take back the original API spec. Let's see. I'm going to enlarge it so that we can see it. If you remember, the book object, sorry, was a nested object. Was composed by price that was an amount, and the amount was still an additional object which had a currency field that was another object. So that was pretty much structured as an object, the book object. So while in the database we flatten the information of the book, let's go back to our shell. We flatten information of our book by storing value and currency without any amount or and without any substructure. That means that whenever we get data from our database, we must which is flattened, we must recreate the resource representation, which is structured in the sense that it had a price with a value and a currency. So to do that, we're going to take the data that we get from the database, and we're going to map for each item the following method. For each element, I'm going to execute the following method. E.price, I'm going to create a price field, which is the one that we expect from our API. It's composed by a value, which is e-value, and the currency, e-currency. So just to show you that the structure of the resource might be different. In this case, it's a little bit different in the sense that it has some structure some structure. It's not flattened. But in other cases, it might be even something much more complex. So there is not always a one-to-one mapping between the resources in our web application and resources that are not and data that is stored into the database. Okay. Now we still need some plumbing to do, in the sense that we now have a way to setting up the book service, but we now have to have a which is not available now. We have to write it, a module that sets up the data layer by invoking the method that we have created in the book service. This is going to be called data layer. This is the entry point. I'm going to edit data layer, and this is using the books DB setup method that I've brought a few minutes ago. Book service. Okay. And it will load the next module. I'm going to call it SQLDB Factory. And I'm going to create a new variable here. Keep in mind that I'm using the same name in this module, but this variable here is local to this module. It's not the same as the other SQLDB variable that I've set up in the book service. And I'm going to invoke SQLDB Factory by creating a connection with my Postgres database by saying that the client is Postgres, and there are a few other fields that you might want to use. For example, debug equal true means that you want to have debugging information whenever you do operation towards the API. Then the connection that you might want to use to the database, this is something which I prefer to use in shell environment variable, because this might change. Whenever you deploy your application into an actual cloud platform, it's going to be the cloud platform that will provide the connection string to your database. And this is typically done through an environment variable. And I'm going to use that environment variable also here. And as you can see, this will mean that we are going to need to invoke our server now with that environment variable set in order to create the connection to the database. This environment variable is accessible through process.amp.database URL, and I'm going to use also SSL. Okay. Okay. So now the SQLDB object has been set up. There will be a function setup data layer, which it's going to be invoked by the main server. I'm going to provide a message setting up and I'm going to return the book DB setup. Now what I'm doing here, I'm invoking the books DB setup method of the service so that I can set up that service with the SQLDB, with the SQLDB variable that is the actual connection to the database. Now, if you add other services, you might want to, keep in mind that all these invocation return a promise. So you might want to invoke all the setup methods of the services and then returning only once those promises have been settled. So now I have only one module to install to set up, so only one service to set up, so I can return directly that the promise that is returned by bookdb setup. Otherwise, you might want to use a promise.all, for example. So we have created a function. Now we are going to export from this module both the database connection. I'm going to call it database, and this is going to be the value of the SQLDB variable, and the function setup data layer. We're going now to invoke setup data layer in our index.js file. And to do that, I'm going to get the setup data layer method from the module data layer, which is in service. Okay, and only once only after I have set up the data layer, I can start the server. Okay, and for this I'm going to use the promise that is returned by setup data layer. So I invoke it, and then only when it is finished, I invoke the function that setups the server, which is this one here. Keep in mind that whenever I'm using the arrow notation, I'm creating an anonymous JavaScript function, which you might want to look at if you are not aware of it. So typically this allows to not use verbose syntax for defining our functions, but in the end it's a function that is called only after setup the data layer has been completed. Now the server should be okay. One thing to note is that I have already a Postgres running, and there is already a books table there, which with a single book, which is another book. I don't remember which book was. So by starting our server now, the server, when I access the books endpoint, should return data from that database. Okay, there is going to be the actual query, and for each request, I'm going to get data from the database. Now, as I was telling before, the server now must be run with an environment variable which describes the database URL to be used for Postgres. And there are several ways to do that depending on the operating system. And if you use Linux or any Linux-like operating system or Mac OS, this is very simply done in the shell by prepending the invocation to index.js with the definition of the database URL. In my case, it's localhost because the server is running locally. And after I've defined it, I can invoke the server itself. Now, that should be running, otherwise. Okay, books DB setup is not a function. There must be some typo. Let's see, setup data layer. Of course, things go wrong during a live demonstration. Books DB setup. Okay, let's see whether in the service a book, so it's books DB setup. Okay, let's see now if it works. Okay, as you can see, we can see all the messages that we wrote in our method invocation, and so it's setting up the data layer, it's checking if the table exists, and you can see here, because we use the debug method in Next, we can see the actual created query toward the database, and it exists. So actually the server, it is not creating a new table, of course, but now it must be able to, whenever I access my bookstore, to get the data and render it. So let's see if it works. Okay, it doesn't, in the sense that now I should have seen the actual book that is stored in our database. First of all, before going to check for the error, let's see the debug information that is coming from Next. Now there is a message that says, okay, a valid integer must be provided to limit. So probably since we didn't provide any limit value in our access to our endpoint, that was probably undefined, and then the next query builder was complaining. So we're going to fix that. And as you can see other information that is associated with the actual query that is sent towards the database. Now we have two ways to do that. The first one is to fix up the server. So let's stop it. We're going to get the book service, and we're going to check. I'm going to say that if not limit, it's equal to, for example, 10. Let's see if this is okay. Okay, so now it's doing the query correctly, but we're not getting any data. Let's see whether we can check. Okay, title of JSON, it's null. Let's see the network, the request. I'm just going to check in the network preview, null. Okay, returned a null value. So this is going to be something which we might want to check in our server. So there has been there is no information coming from our database. So let me check commander. I'm just going to use okay, the book is there, but let's debug this information. let's see whether this is just going to print directly the information returned by the query, just to see whether okay, the query actually returns the book. Sorry. The information of this book has been written before into the database by using you know, a Postgres client that it's called PG Commander. I mean, it's non-influential for. I mean, how do you get data into the database is something that we're not going to really see in this course. I can let me see whether I can share with you the screen associated with the EG Commander. Let's see. Okay, so this is the client that I use for managing the queries in my database. Sorry. Okay, so you can see here that there is a book called The Hobbit, which is actually which I wrote before, and you can create new values by, you know, using the interface. It's something which you might want to use anything else that works for you, but the fact is that you want to fill up information in the database with the tools that you have at your disposal. So coming back to the original problem, we see here, we see that let me open again the chat. So as I was telling, the information from the database is returned correctly because it has been printed by our printf, but it doesn't return back to our now let's check into the controllers whether we did everything okay. So that should be okay. Let's see what is returned here in the response. It's undefined, so it returns an undefined value. Okay. So books.get returns an undefined value. So we probably screwed up the books get so let's see whether this is just some debugging on the fly. Sorry for that, but okay, this is undefined. That's cool. So okay, I must return here. Okay. So let's see if it works. Okay, that that works. So just to recap, I filled up the some information in the database, and I've set up the connection by modifying the services that you have seen before, by adding the data layer module and so on, by setting up the index.js file. And now, whenever I do a get towards the books endpoint, that triggers a query into the database and returns the actual data in the database, not the examples that we have just removed. So that's that somehow closes the circle, in the sense that you have seen how it is possible to have an API have an API that generates a server, a skeleton of a server, and how to modify those modules to hook up a database. Now, of course, for your application, that is going to be a lot of work, in the sense that we'll have a lot of tables and endpoints. My suggestion is to really limit the endpoints, just to really avoid the effort to really then create several queries to the database. Just focus on the most important endpoints, and that closes the lecture of today, because it's 12 o'clock, and unfortunately I have to leave now, but tomorrow we are going to take back the last part of this small tutorial, which concerns the authentication. And I will answer all the questions, even concerning the databases that we've seen today, tomorrow, because today it's not possible for me. I have other lectures to do just after this one. So see you then tomorrow, and thank you very much.